The movie, based on true events, begins with Robert Oppenheimer having a vision of an atomic explosion. He is at a safety hearing and reads his address to the commission, which states the need to view the case through the lens of his life and work. The commissioners are curious as to why the scientist left the US. Isn't it only possible to study physics in Europe? In 1926, the young Oppenheimer studied in Cambridge with the eminent physicist Patrick Blackett. However, the arrogance of the instructor and personal dislike prompts the student to poison his apple, but not with such a strong fear, but with a banal poison. In the morning, Oppenheimer comes to his senses and runs back to the classroom in time to retrieve the apple. Blackett introduces him to Niels Bohr, Nobel Prize winner in the face of Hercule Poirot, who nearly bites off the apple. Bohr advises him to change universities to better fulfill his potential. Heeding the advice, the student moves to the German Göttingen under the wing of Max Born, where he plunges into the abysses of quantum physics, bordering on madness. The story shifts to Louis Strauss, who 5 years later is preparing for his conferment. He is questioned about his acquaintance and collaboration with Oppenheimer. As a simple businessman, Strauss is somewhat offended by the condescension of Oppenheimer, who prefers his society to Einstein's campaign on the pond. After completing his studies at Göttingen and earning a scientific degree, Oppenheimer lectures on quantum physics in German. He also attends a lecture by a colleague. In the course of a short conversation, it turns out that Oppenheimer is returning to the United States. Nostalgia tortured, and quantum physics they need to promote. Having received a professor's mantle, the physicist gets acquainted with Ernest Lawrence, who was once a drug dealer from the trunk. The sophomore became an outstanding scientist and builds the world's first cyclotron. Oppenheimer teaches his first lesson to a single student, but soon word of mouth does its job, and the classroom is filled with new listeners. At the hearing, it turns out that on the orders of FBI Chief Hoover, the dossier on Oppenheimer began to be collected before the outbreak of World War II because of his political views. The physicist's social circle shares the view that the American government sympathizes with fascists. Despite the socialists, he meets Jean Tatlock, a member of the Communist Party of the United States, who is under surveillance by the authorities. A spark runs between them, igniting distance and clothing. The relationship between them is not very smooth. Trouble on the personal front. Complicating matters is the news of science. The Germans managed to split the uranium nucleus, which Oppenheimer himself considered impossible. The theoretical justification of this process leads him to think of a chain reaction that could be used in a bomb. An article about this is published on September 1, 1939. But the success of the scientists is overshadowed by another piece of news from Germany: Poland failed. At the hearing, Oppenheimer admits that the neutrality of the communists after the start of World War II caused him to abandon his sympathies for them, despite the fact that his wife Kitty was a member of the Communist Party. Despite his acquaintance and romantic relationship with Kitty, he has not stopped socializing with Jean, who suffers from mood swings. The communist sentiments of the students are not too pleasant for the teaching staff, who persecute political opponents by decree. Lawrence hints to Oppenheimer that he is already under surveillance. This fact comes up at the Strauss hearing. The council wonders why, knowing about his political views, the physicist offered him to head the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. After the birth of his firstborn child, Oppenheimer's family life is somewhat complicated, forcing him to even give up his new position in favor of a colleague. The scientists plan to work on the development of the atomic bomb to get ahead of the Nazis. Having cured alcoholism by horseback riding, Kitty convinces her husband to return to the case. Without him, the others will not cope. Soon Oppenheimer is visited by General Groves, a man who knows firsthand the value of saving soldiers on the fields of World War II. He offers the scientist to head the Manhattan Project, before Heisenberg and the Nazis have done it before. The physicist agrees and immediately begins to plan how to organize everything for this in Los Alamos, that in the state of New Mexico builds a special laboratory removed from human eyes. At the same time, he and the general are traveling around the country and recruiting talented scientists to work. Sometime later, perhaps 28 days later, the team arrives at the lab under construction. Some of them are tormented by moral and ethical questions. They have the right to create weapons of mass destruction that are bound to harm innocents. The very first meeting of the project participants for discussion exposes another serious problem in the calculations, telling them to double-check them again. Oppenheimer goes to Einstein for a consultation. It is feared that the explosion caused by the decay of uranium could set off a chain reaction so powerful and uncontrollable that it would spread to the entire world and destroy it. But the fear of the Nazis is stronger than the fear of man-made Armageddon. Thanks to repeated calculations, the probability is close to zero. Soon old friends hint to the scientist that it would be a good idea to help the communist comrades as much as possible by leaking them some information. Oppenheimer refuses, which is reported at the hearing. This information is also relevant to the Strauss case. If the scientist leaked anything, he'll be charged with aiding and abetting. He needs witnesses to prove that the physicist did not pass secret information to outsiders, although it has long been known that the Soviet Union has its own atomic bombs. At a meeting at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer tells the audience about Halifax, where the most powerful explosion in history at the time occurred. Discussing the theory of the atomic bang, one of his colleagues immediately suggests the next step of the hydrogen bomb, which is still based on the atomic bomb. In the meantime, Colonel Groves visits the base to remind them that the information is secret and must be guarded, more carefully separated and dominated, so that the employee doesn't know what colleagues are doing. This is the only way to keep things secret. But this is contrary to the practice of general discussions practiced by Oppenheimer. During the development of the bomb, Oppenheimer visits Chicago, where the experimenters manage to create a self-sustaining chain reaction. The trip does not escape Groves' attention. His reprimand becomes the reason for the departure of one of the scientists unwilling to work under such pressure. At the hearing, Groves expresses his belief that Oppenheimer did not pass classified data to the Soviets, although he himself saw his team violate security protocols. Nevertheless, one of Oppenheimer's former colleagues openly supported the communists for any connection with him. The authorities automatically branded him as untrustworthy. But the physicist himself preferred to spend the night with Jean Tatlock while his wife babysat. Information about these meetings makes Kitty promptly get away, leaving her cheating husband without moral support at the hearing. Oppenheimer is interrogated by Boris Pash, a Russian-born counterintelligence officer in charge of security for the Manhattan Project. He believes that the scientist is a secret communist, but the physicist himself, who has been tried more than once to recruit, feeds him with half hints, a theory about some secret network of spies, theoretically capable of gaining his trust. Oppenheimer relates the case to Groves, who eventually sends Pash to Europe to do intelligence work. They're to protect the project from undue attention from the authorities. At Christmas, the Groves bring Niels Bohr to visit the scientists. He gets acquainted with the team's calculations and in the process gives a good idea that could push the work further. He also warns Oppenheimer that the creation of weapons of such power cannot so much save the world as destroy it, and it will be on his conscience. At the same time, Oppenheimer is informed about the suicide of Jean Tatlock. She took pills and drowned herself in the bathtub to be sure, at least that's what it looks like. Worried about his first love, the scientist retreats into the woods, where he is found shivering with cold by his lawful wife Kitty. But it is necessary to continue work, even though there is discord and vacillation among the team. One of the employees even leaves unable to come to terms with the atmosphere within the team. Edward Teller keeps running with the idea of a hydrogen bomb, which still requires a working atomic bomb. His ideas are even brought up for discussion by politicians. By that time, it is already clear that fascism in Europe is living out its last days. Now the main threat to the Yankees are the Russians, and to subdue them, we need a bigger bomb. Oppenheimer believes that the creation of such an ultimatum weapon will force the Soviets to quickly prepare a decent response, copying the technology. The scientist meets Borden, who later writes a detailed report accusing him of sabotage in the development of the bomb. In what he was helped by the physicist's personal file leaked by ill-wishers from the military department. Oppenheimer himself, speaking to students, justifying the potential use of the atomic bomb for the sake of world peace under the careful guidance of the United States, of course. Groves, with Oppenheimer, prepares for the first test of the atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity. Prior to this, the team tests the fuses and calculates the power to designate a safe distance for observation. In parallel, the Department of Defense is already discussing a nuclear bombing of Tokyo. So, victimized by American air raids. The discussion is moving seamlessly from one of the bomb will save soldiers' lives. After the war, more bombs are needed to counter the Soviets. A decision is made to conduct a test in July 45, a few days before the planned Potsdam Conference, so that Truman would have something to get back in front of Stalin. Oppenheimer's team speeds up preparations, setting up observation points and assembling a prototype. Assembled on site, the bomb is hoisted onto a steel tower the day before Oppenheimer leaves home and sets out to test it. He personally goes up to the attached bomb to realize the magnitude of what is to come, then waits with the others in a camp nearby for the start, with the explosion scheduled for 6:30 on the morning of July 16th. The physicist and general spends a sleepless night in the bunker, worried that the chain reaction in theory could destroy the entire world. In the morning, even before dawn, the MGLU is cut through by flares signaling that 20 minutes remain before the test. Scientists and military personnel take their places in observation stations. The timer counting down the last seconds builds up the tension. Then the night is illuminated by an incredibly bright blind flash, after which a huge mushroom shimmering with clubs of fire rises to it. A shockwave reaches the observation points, which is followed by a wave of jubilation. The test was a success. The team welcomes Oppenheimer as a hero. They applaud and congratulate him. After the test, the military builds new bomb samples for use in field tests on Japanese test subjects. The scientist learns from the general that Truman only hinted to Stalin about the existence of a powerful new weapon. Staring at the trucks, Oppenheimer begins to grate with moral questions about the permissibility of using such weapons against civilians. Later, on the radio, he hears the president speak about the bombing of Hiroshima. The military are jubilant, for the surrender of Japan is just around the corner, and with it the final end of the war. Oppenheimer does not share the general jubilation, feeling responsible for many deaths, but also suffers not too much. More for show, combining the experience with a performance in front of the team. Except a fleeting vision overshadows the big day. His picture graces the cover of Time magazine. President Truman honors the scientist with an audience. As a savvy arms dealer, the president raves about Oppenheimer. When the scientist suggests international cooperation in atomic energy, the advisor objects that the Soviets will never have such a bomb. So now the US can command the parade. But if the USSR is to have a chance to respond, the US must continue to develop atomic weapons. Disappointed by Oppenheimer's pacifism, Truman ends the meeting. At the hearing, it is revealed that Oppenheimer's further work was to limit US nuclear capability within reasonable limits and not to pursue a hydrogen bomb. This leads to a conflict of interest with Strauss. Using his connections, the latter subjects relatives and friends, the scientist, to reprisals. It turns out that the Manhattan Project has been recruited by the Soviets as data agents. Suspicion is aggravated by the speech of Oppenheimer himself, calling the authorities to open dialogue. Faced with photographs of the aftermath of the atomic strike, the scientist again plunges into reflection. Teller hints that World War II smoothly developed into a Cold War with the USSR and asks his boss to get involved in the creation of a hydrogen bomb. But he is adamant. During the hearing on the case of Strauss, aspiring to the post of Secretary of Commerce, unseemly facts of his enmity with Oppenheimer, to whom he has long put sticks in the wheels. It was Strauss, using the physicist's connection to the communists, organized a closed and biased hearing on security to damage the reputation and nerves of the latter. At this event called many of Oppenheimer's colleagues to obtain testimony that will serve for the necessary verdict. Dr. Hill is called as a witness. He takes the liberty of speaking for the majority of the country's scientists and opposes the appointment of Strauss as minister. The reason for this is not concern for the security of the country, as the politician imagined, but personal motives, for which he organized the repression of Oppenheimer. If he could destroy the reputation of such a man, he would crush ordinary scientists. Based on this testimony, the commission decides to deny Strauss a ministerial appointment. Among those who refused is the young Senator John F. Kennedy, who did not like the way Oppenheimer was treated. The film ends with a scene where the elderly Oppenheimer is presented with an award by the president for his achievements in the energy industry, recognizing his service to the country. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe. See you soon.